Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the muddy, blood-soaked boots of a medieval soldier. And trust me, you're going to wish you'd stayed in your comfortable modern bed. Picture this, you're standing in a field at dawn, mist rising from the ground that's been churned into a paste of mud, blood, and things you don't want to think about. Your hands are shaking not from cold, but from the knowledge that today might be the day you meet your maker in the most gruesome way imaginable. The metallic taste of fear coats your tongue as you grip a weapon you've barely learned to use, surrounded by men who smell like they haven't bathed since the Crusades began. You probably think you could handle medieval warfare because you've seen Game of Thrones or played some video games, but the brutal reality would have you crying for your mother within the first hour. The romanticized version of knights in shining armor is about as accurate as saying McDonald's serves gourmet cuisine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time at ISI. Love seeing our global night owl community come together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The moment you even think about becoming a medieval soldier, you're already making your first potentially fatal mistake. See, medieval armies didn't exactly have recruitment offices with friendly staff and signing bonuses. Instead, picture yourself as a peasant farmer, maybe 15 or 16 years old, barely what we'd consider a high school student today, when the local lord's men come thundering into your village on horseback. Their message is simple: you're now a soldier, whether you like it or not. The recruitment process was about as voluntary as paying taxes. Your lord owned you, essentially, and if he decided he needed more bodies for his army, congratulations, you just got drafted. The feudal system meant that every able-bodied man owed military service to his lord, and able-bodied was interpreted rather generously. Missing a few fingers? You could still hold a spear. Partially blind? You could probably see well enough to stab in the general direction of the enemy. Your training begins immediately, and by training, I mean you're essentially thrown into a medieval boot camp designed by sadists. The training master, usually a grizzled veteran who somehow survived multiple campaigns, looks at your soft, farm-working hands and immediately knows you're probably going to die horribly. But hey, that's not his problem. His job is to turn you from a dirt-farming peasant into something resembling a warrior in the shortest time possible. The training camp itself is a nightmare that would make modern boot camps look like luxury resorts. You sleep on the ground, often without any shelter whatsoever, in whatever weather conditions happen to be occurring. Rain, snow, blazing heat, the elements become your constant companions and tormentors. Your bed is literally the earth, maybe with a thin layer of straw if you're incredibly lucky, and you share the space with dozens of other unwashed, terrified recruits. Your first lesson involves learning to march in formation while carrying equipment that weighs more than a modern soldier's full battle gear. You're handed a spear that's longer than you are tall, a shield that feels like it's made of solid lead, and whatever scraps of armor the army can scrounge up. The spear becomes your best friend and worst enemy simultaneously. It's your primary weapon, your walking stick, and the thing that's going to give you splinters in places you never knew could get splinters. The physical conditioning would make modern CrossFit enthusiasts weep openly. You wake before dawn, and I mean before dawn, when it's still pitch black, and the only way you know it's morning is because someone starts kicking you awake, and immediately begin practicing spear work until your arms feel like overcooked pasta. Then it's sword training with wooden weapons that hurt just as much as real ones when they crack against your ribs. After that, you practice shield work until your left arm is completely numb, followed by hours of marching in full gear across whatever hostile terrain the training master can find. The spear training alone would break most modern people within a week. You start by learning basic thrusts. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. You're holding a 12-foot wooden pole with a sharp metal point, trying to coordinate your movements with dozens of other confused peasants who are also waving around 12-foot wooden poles with sharp metal points. The mathematical probability of someone getting accidentally stabbed is approaching certainty, and it happens regularly. But here's where it gets really interesting. Medieval military training wasn't just about physical preparation. You also had to learn the complex social hierarchy of medieval warfare, which was more complicated than understanding modern tax code. You needed to know which nobles outranked others, how to properly address a knight without getting backhanded, and the intricate system of military etiquette that could mean the difference between a promotion and a public flogging. The social hierarchy was absolutely crucial to understand because screwing it up could literally get you killed by your own side. Knights expected to be addressed as my lord or sir, and failure to show proper respect could result in immediate and violent consequences. But here's the catch: different regions had different customs, and armies often included men from various territories with conflicting social expectations. Navigate this wrong, and you might find yourself on the wrong end of a sword held by someone who's supposedly on your team. Historians still argue whether medieval training was deliberately brutal to weed out weak recruits or if commanders simply didn't care about casualty rates during preparation. Some scholars suggest that the harsh training was designed to simulate battle conditions, while others argue that medieval military leaders genuinely believed that suffering built character and combat effectiveness. What we do know is that many recruits died during training from exhaustion, injuries, or simple accidents with weapons they barely knew how to hold. The mortality rate during the first month of military service was absolutely staggering. Some estimates suggest that up to 30% of new recruits didn't survive their initial training period. Think about that for a moment. You had a better chance of survival playing Russian roulette than making it through medieval basic training. These weren't battle casualties. These were deaths from training accidents, disease, exhaustion, and the dozens of other ways that medieval military life could kill you before you even saw combat. Your daily routine involves waking up in whatever shelter you can find, usually just a lean-to made of branches and mud, and immediately reporting for weapons practice. The training master doesn't care if you're sick, injured, or suffering from the medieval equivalent of food poisoning. You practice until you can barely stand, then you practice some more. The philosophy was simple: better to collapse during training than on the battlefield where your failure could get everyone killed. Morning weapons practice started with individual drills, learning to thrust your spear properly, which involved coordinating your entire body in a movement that looks simple but requires months to master. You had to learn to step forward with the thrust, keep your balance, maintain your grip on the weapon, and be ready to quickly withdraw and reset for the next attack. All of this while wearing whatever armor you'd been issued and carrying a shield that weighs as much as a small child. The psychological aspect of training was particularly brutal and deliberately designed to break you down mentally before building you back up. You were constantly reminded that your life was essentially worthless in the grand scheme of medieval warfare. Common foot soldiers were considered expendable resources, like arrows or horses. The training deliberately broke down your sense of individual identity and rebuilt you as part of a military unit that functioned as a single organism. This wasn't team building, this was psychological reconstruction on a scale that would make modern military psychologists uncomfortable. The verbal abuse from training officers was constant and creative. They had developed an entire vocabulary of insults specifically designed to humiliate recruits and break down their civilian mentality. You were no longer John the farmer or William the baker. You were a maggot, a worm, a waste of food and air who might, if you were incredibly lucky and worked harder than you'd ever worked in your life, eventually become worthy of dying for your Lord. Weapon training focused primarily on the spear, since that's what most foot soldiers would actually use in battle. Swords were expensive and required years of training to master effectively, so they were reserved for the wealthy and the professional warrior class. Your spear training involved learning to thrust, parry, and maintain formation while other soldiers did the same around you. One wrong move could result in accidentally spearing your comrade, which happened more often than military records like to admit. The spear formations were incredibly complex and required perfect coordination between dozens of men. You had to learn to advance in lockstep, maintain proper spacing, and coordinate your attacks with the soldiers around you. The famous phalanx formations of antiquity were still used in modified forms during medieval warfare, and they required months of practice to execute effectively. A single soldier breaking formation could create a gap that enemy forces could exploit, potentially leading to the collapse of an entire battle line. Shield work was another crucial skill that sounds much simpler than it actually is. Your shield wasn't just a piece of wood and metal you held in front of you. It was an active weapon that required strength, timing, and coordination to use effectively. You had to learn to block incoming attacks while simultaneously positioning your shield to protect not just yourself but the soldiers around you. The shield wall technique, where overlapping shields created a nearly impenetrable barrier, required every soldier to coordinate their movements perfectly. The truly terrifying part of medieval military training was the knowledge that it was all just preparation for something infinitely worse. Every exercise, every drill, every brutal conditioning session was designed to prepare you for the nightmare of actual medieval combat. Your trainers had survived real battles, and the haunted look in their eyes told you everything you needed to know about what waited beyond the training ground. Physical fitness standards were whatever kept you alive long enough to be useful in battle. There were no standardized tests or graduation ceremonies. You were ready for combat when your commanding officer decided you wouldn't immediately die the moment you encountered enemy forces. Sometimes this took weeks, sometimes months, but usually, external events like an approaching enemy army decided your training schedule for you. The weapons you trained with were often damaged or inferior versions of real battlefield equipment. New recruits didn't get the good gear that went to experienced soldiers who had proven they could survive long enough to justify the investment. You practiced with chipped sword blades, cracked shields, and spear points that had seen better decades. The logic was brutally simple. Why waste good equipment on someone who probably won't live long enough to use it effectively? Equipment maintenance became a crucial skill that nobody bothered to teach you formally. You had to figure out on your own how to keep your weapons sharp, your armor from rusting, and your shield from falling apart. These skills often meant the difference between life and death in combat, but they were considered basic knowledge that soldiers were expected to acquire through trial and error. Medical care during training was virtually non-existent by modern standards. The Army's medical corps consisted of whoever had picked up some basic knowledge about treating wounds, often through the extremely hands-on experience of previous campaigns. Injuries were treated with whatever folk remedies the Army's unofficial physicians could cobble together. A broken bone might be set with splints and prayers, but infection was always a death sentence. Many recruits who survived the physical demands of training succumbed to infections from minor wounds that would be easily treatable today. The lack of medical knowledge meant that even minor injuries could become life-threatening complications. A small cut from weapons practice could become infected and lead to death within days. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory, and no sterile techniques. Wound treatment often involved pouring wine or ale on injuries, which actually had some antiseptic properties, though nobody understood why and hoping for the best. The social dynamics of training were equally challenging and often deadly. You were thrown together with men from different villages, different social backgrounds, and sometimes different languages. Medieval armies were melting pots of regional cultures, and the friction between different groups often led to fights, feuds, and occasionally murders within the ranks. Learning to work with these diverse groups while under extreme stress was a skill that many recruits never mastered. Conflicts between different regional groups were common and sometimes escalated into full-scale brawls that left soldiers dead or seriously injured before they ever saw combat. A soldier from the northern mountains might have cultural conflicts with a recruit from the southern farmlands, and these tensions were often exacerbated by the stress and fear of military training. Commanding officers dealt with these conflicts through harsh discipline, but the underlying tensions often persisted throughout entire campaigns. Your training culminated in mock battles that were designed to simulate actual combat conditions as closely as possible without quite killing everyone involved. These exercises involved full contact fighting with real weapons, though sometimes the edges were dulled slightly for safety. Slightly being the operative word. Training accidents were common and often fatal. The mock battles were chaos incarnate. With dozens of men fighting in close quarters using weapons they were still learning to control effectively. By the time your training was considered complete, you had been transformed from whatever you were before into something resembling a medieval war machine. But here's the cruel irony. All this preparation was just the beginning. Everything you had learned, every skill you had developed, every piece of knowledge you had absorbed was about to be tested in the most unforgiving environment imaginable. Actual medieval warfare, where the stakes were infinitely higher and the margin for error was exactly zero. Now that you've somehow survived the nightmare of medieval military training, it's time to get you properly equipped for battle. And by properly equipped, I mean strapped into what essentially amounts to a wearable torture device that costs more than your family's entire net worth. Welcome to the wonderful world of medieval armor, where protection comes with a side order of bankruptcy, heat stroke, and the constant possibility of drowning in 3 inches of water. Let's start with the basics. You can't afford armor. Not real armor. Anyway, a full suit of plate armor cost roughly the equivalent of a modern luxury car, which puts it well beyond the reach of your average peasant turned soldier. Even a basic mail shirt that's chainmail to you cost about as much as a decent used car today. So unless you're the second son of a wealthy noble, you're looking at whatever scraps and hand-me-downs the army can scrounge up for you. The economic reality of medieval armor would shock modern military personnel. Professional armorers were among the highest-paid craftsmen in medieval society, and their products reflected those premium labor costs. A master armorer might spend months creating a single suit of plate armor, with each piece individually fitted and tested. The materials alone high-quality steel, leather, brass fittings, and specialized tools represented a fortune by medieval standards. Your armor is more likely to be a padded jacket called a gambeson, which is essentially a quilt that someone optimistically decided might stop a sword. The gambeson is made from layers of linen or wool stuffed with whatever padding material is available: straw, old rags, maybe some animal hair if you're lucky. It looks like something your grandmother might have made for a particularly aggressive quilting competition, and it provides about as much protection as you'd expect from a medieval sleeping bag. But don't underestimate the gambeson just because it looks like oversized pajamas. This padded armor was actually quite effective against certain types of attacks, particularly arrows and slashing weapons. The layers of fabric could absorb and distribute impact forces, and a well-made gambeson could stop arrows from lighter bows. However, it was virtually useless against powerful crossbow bolts or direct thrusting attacks from spears and swords. Even this pathetic excuse for armor weighs far more than you anticipated. A full gambeson weighs around 15 to 20 pounds, and that's before you add anything else to your ensemble. Remember, you're a medieval peasant who's probably never carried anything heavier than a sack of grain, and now you're expected to fight while wearing what feels like a lead blanket that's been soaked in water. The weight distribution of a gambeson creates unique problems that modern soldiers don't face. Unlike modern body armor that distributes weight across the torso with advanced materials, the gambeson hangs from your shoulders and restricts arm movement. After several hours of wear, your shoulders develop a burning ache that never goes away, and your range of motion becomes increasingly limited as the padding compresses and shifts. If you're incredibly fortunate or if enough soldiers have died recently to free up some equipment, you might get issued a mail shirt. Chainmail looks impressive in movies, but in reality, it's a nightmare to wear and maintain. Each mail shirt contains thousands of individually linked metal rings, and if even one link breaks, the entire structural integrity is compromised. Repairing chain mail requires specialized tools and skills that most soldiers don't possess, so damaged mail often stays damaged until it becomes completely useless. The construction of chainmail is a marvel of medieval craftsmanship that you'll never fully appreciate until you have to maintain it yourself. Each ring is individually forged and linked to 4 neighboring rings in a pattern that requires precise measurements and consistent quality. A single mail shirt might contain anywhere from 20,000 to 100,000 individual rings, depending on the size and quality of the armor. The labor involved in creating chainmail was enormous, which explains why it was so expensive. The weight of chainmail is distributed differently than modern protective gear, and your body isn't prepared for this type of load. A basic mail shirt weighs between 25 and 40 pounds, and that weight hangs from your shoulders and neck like a metal waterfall. Imagine wearing a backpack filled with rocks on your chest for 12 hours while running, fighting, and trying not to die. Your shoulders will be screaming in agony within the first hour, and that's before anyone starts trying to kill you. Chainmail creates pressure points on your body that become increasingly painful over time. The shoulders bear most of the weight, but the armor also presses against your hips, chest, and back in ways that create bruising and chafing. Medieval soldiers developed permanent indentations and scars from wearing mail regularly, and these physical changes became badges of military service that lasted for life. Chainmail also has the delightful property of conducting heat like a medieval oven. In summer, wearing mail is like being slowly cooked in a metal griddle that happens to be shaped like clothing. The metal absorbs heat from the sun and from your body, creating a personal sauna that can literally cook you alive. Heat exhaustion in armor killed more medieval soldiers than many battles, and that's not an exaggeration. Overheating in metal clothing is genuinely lethal. The thermal properties of metal armor created temperature extremes that would challenge modern soldiers equipped with advanced cooling systems. During hot weather, the metal became hot enough to cause burns if it contacted exposed skin directly. Soldiers learned to wear thick padding underneath mail not just for comfort, but to prevent the heated metal from literally branding them during combat. Winter presented the opposite problem. Chainmail became a conductor of cold that could cause frostbite and hypothermia. The metal would freeze to any exposed skin it contacted, and soldiers sometimes had to carefully warm their armor before putting it on to prevent cold injuries. Medieval armies operating in winter conditions faced constant challenges with equipment that actively worked against their survival. The cleaning and maintenance of armor is a full-time job that nobody prepared you for during training. Chain mail rusts if it gets wet and stays wet, which is constantly because medieval soldiers rarely have opportunities to properly dry their equipment. You're supposed to clean your mail regularly with sand and oil, rubbing each individual link to prevent rust. This process takes hours and must be done frequently, often by candlelight in whatever shelter you can find. The maintenance routine for chainmail was incredibly labor-intensive and never-ending. After each use, the mail had to be cleaned of blood, dirt, and other contaminants that could cause corrosion. The traditional cleaning method involved placing the mail in a barrel with sand and vinegar, then rolling the barrel to scrub each link clean. This process could take an entire day and had to be repeated regularly to prevent rust damage. Oil was crucial for mail maintenance, but quality oil was expensive and not always available during campaigns. Soldiers used whatever oils they could find: animal fat, vegetable oils, even human body oils in desperate situations. Poor quality oil could actually accelerate corrosion, so soldiers had to develop expertise in selecting and applying protective coatings. Historians still argue whether the famous white armor of late medieval knights was primarily functional or ceremonial. But for common soldiers, the question is academic because you'll never see armor that fancy. Your equipment is brown, dented, patched, and has been worn by at least 3 previous soldiers, 2 of whom probably died wearing it. The bloodstains have been scrubbed out, mostly, but the dents remain as permanent reminders of your armor's violent history. The psychological impact of wearing dead men's armor cannot be understated. Medieval soldiers were superstitious by modern standards, and many believed that armor retained some essence of its previous owners. Wearing equipment that had belonged to dead soldiers created anxiety and fear that could affect combat performance. Some soldiers refused to wear armor from deceased comrades, preferring inferior new equipment to superior used gear. But let's say you get really lucky and somehow acquire actual plate armor. Congratulations! You've just strapped yourself into a metal prison that will probably kill you in ways you never imagined. Plate armor looks magnificent and provides excellent protection, but it comes with trade-offs that would horrify modern soldiers. The weight of full plate armor ranges from 50 to 70 pounds, distributed across your entire body in a way that restricts nearly every movement you might want to make. The engineering behind plate armor was remarkably sophisticated, representing centuries of metalworking advancement and battlefield experience. Each piece was carefully shaped to deflect incoming attacks while allowing maximum mobility within the constraints of the technology. However, this sophistication came at the cost of incredible complexity. A full suit of plate armor contained dozens of individual pieces, each with specific functions and attachment points. Getting into plate armor is a complex process that requires assistance from at least one other person, preferably someone who knows what they're doing. The armor consists of dozens of individual pieces that must be attached in the correct order, with proper adjustments for fit and mobility. Each piece has specific attachment points, leather straps, and metal buckles that can break or come loose at the worst possible moment. If your armor bearer gets killed during battle, you might be stuck in your metal shell until someone friendly finds you. The arming process for plate armor could take 30 to 60 minutes even with experienced assistance. Each piece had to be properly positioned, adjusted for fit, and secured with multiple attachment points. The sequence was crucial. Putting pieces on in the wrong order could make it impossible to attach subsequent pieces or could create dangerous gaps in protection. The complexity of plate armor created dependencies that could be fatal in military situations. If key pieces were damaged or lost, the entire suit might become unwearable. A broken buckle or torn strap could render expensive armor useless, and field repairs were often impossible without specialized tools and expertise. Soldiers wearing plate armor needed dedicated support personnel just to maintain their equipment. Moving in plate armor requires relearning basic human locomotion. Walking becomes a deliberate, energy-intensive process that sounds like a mobile scrap metal collection. Running is nearly impossible for more than short distances, and getting back up if you fall requires techniques that must be practiced extensively. Medieval knights trained for years to move effectively in plate armor, and you've had maybe a few weeks to figure it out. The biomechanics of moving in plate armor challenged every assumption about human movement. Simple actions like bending over, reaching overhead, or turning quickly became complex maneuvers that required planning and coordination. The armor's weight shifted your center of gravity and changed how your muscles had to work to maintain balance and generate movement. Combat techniques in plate armor were completely different from unarmored fighting. Swords became primarily thrusting weapons used to target gaps in armor, while blunt weapons like maces and hammers became more effective against armored opponents. The entire martial arts system had to be adapted for fighters wearing metal shells that changed how they could move and attack. The claustrophobia of wearing a full helmet is something that no amount of training can fully prepare you for. Your vision is restricted to whatever you can see through narrow slits or holes. Your hearing is muffled, and breathing becomes a conscious effort. The helmet traps heat and moisture, creating a personal fog bank around your face that makes everything seem dreamlike and surreal. Many soldiers panic the first time they wear a closed helmet, and that panic can be fatal in combat. Medieval helmet design prioritized protection over comfort or visibility, creating severe sensory restrictions that affected combat effectiveness. The narrow vision slits provided minimal peripheral vision, making it difficult to track multiple opponents or maintain situational awareness. Hearing was so compromised that verbal communication became nearly impossible during battle. The breathing restrictions of closed helmets created additional stress during physical exertion. The small breathing holes couldn't provide adequate airflow during intense activity, leading to oxygen deprivation that could cause dizziness and exhaustion. Many soldiers learned to fight with their visors raised, trading protection for the ability to breathe and see properly. Ventilation in armor is essentially non-existent. Medieval armorers hadn't quite figured out the concept of air circulation, so wearing armor is like being sealed in a metal can with no air conditioning. Your sweat has nowhere to go, so it just accumulates inside the armor, creating a warm, wet environment that's perfect for breeding bacteria and skin infections. After a few days of wearing armor, you develop medieval equivalents of conditions that modern soldiers call crotch rot and boot rot, except it's your entire body. The hygiene problems created by wearing armor for extended periods were serious health concerns that could incapacitate soldiers as effectively as enemy weapons. Skin infections, fungal growth, and bacterial contamination thrived in the warm, moist environment inside armor. These conditions caused pain, reduced mobility, and could become life-threatening if left untreated. Medieval soldiers developed various strategies for managing hygiene while wearing armor, including the use of absorbent materials, regular cleaning when possible, and herbal remedies for skin conditions. However, during active campaigns, proper hygiene was often impossible, leading to widespread health problems among armored troops. The bathroom situation while wearing armor is a logistical nightmare that medieval military manuals somehow forgot to address. Getting out of armor to relieve yourself is time-consuming and requires assistance, but human biology doesn't care about your equipment situation. Many soldiers simply relieved themselves while wearing their armor, which created additional hygiene problems and made the already unpleasant experience of wearing metal clothing even more disgusting. The practical solutions to biological needs while wearing armor were crude and often unsanitary. Some armor designs included removable pieces or strategic gaps that allowed soldiers to relieve themselves without fully disarming. But these compromises often reduced protection in vulnerable areas. The smell and unsanitary conditions created by these practices contributed to disease transmission and morale problems. Sleeping in armor was sometimes necessary during campaigns, and it's about as comfortable as it sounds. You can't lie flat because the armor doesn't bend that way, so you sleep sitting up or propped against something solid. The metal conducts cold during winter nights, making you feel like you're sleeping inside a refrigerator, while during summer it retains heat and makes rest nearly impossible. Quality sleep in armor is essentially impossible, which means you're always fighting while exhausted. The sleep deprivation caused by armor created cumulative effects that reduced combat effectiveness over time. Soldiers wearing armor for extended periods experienced chronic fatigue, reduced reaction times, and impaired decision-making abilities. These effects compounded over the course of long campaigns, potentially making armored soldiers less effective than their unarmored counterparts in some situations. Medieval military commanders had to balance the protection provided by armor against the physical and psychological costs of wearing it. Extended campaigns required careful consideration of when armor should be worn versus when soldiers needed rest and recovery time. The logistics of managing armored troops included provisions for equipment maintenance, medical care for armor-related injuries, and rotation schedules to prevent exhaustion. So you've survived training and gotten used to your mobile torture chamber, your protective armor, and now it's time to discuss the weapons that are supposed to keep you alive in medieval combat. Spoiler alert. Everything you think you know about medieval weapons from movies and video games is probably wrong, and the reality is far more terrifying and far less glamorous than anything Hollywood has ever shown you. Let's start with the weapon you're most likely to actually use in battle: the spear. Not a sword's words are expensive, require years of training to use effectively, and are primarily status symbols for the wealthy. Your primary weapon is a 12-foot wooden pole with a sharp metal point, and if that sounds unimpressive, you clearly haven't thought through the mathematics of medieval warfare. A spear gives you reach, which means you can stab someone before they can stab you, assuming you don't trip over your own feet or accidentally impale your fellow soldiers. The spear seems simple enough. Pointy end goes in the enemy, right? Wrong. Using a spear effectively requires coordination, timing, and strength that most people simply don't possess. You're holding a 12-foot lever with the weight concentrated at the tip, which means controlling it requires constant muscle tension and perfect balance. Your arms will be burning with fatigue within minutes of active combat, and that's assuming you don't get distracted by people trying to kill you. Spear combat is nothing like the elegant pole fighting you've seen in martial arts movies. Real spear fighting is brutal, chaotic, and exhausting. You're trying to thrust a long, unwieldy weapon at moving targets while they're trying to do the same to you, all while maintaining formation with dozens of other soldiers who are also waving around 12-foot wooden death sticks. The mathematical probability of friendly fire casualties is approaching certainty. The tip of your spear, assuming it's actually sharp, which isn't guaranteed with Army-issued equipment, can penetrate armor if you thrust with enough force and hit the right spot. But here's the problem. Medieval combat isn't a series of precise, controlled attacks. It's a chaotic melee where you're exhausted, terrified, and struggling to see through whatever helmet you're wearing while people scream and die around you. Your carefully practiced thrusting technique goes out the window the moment real combat begins. Maintaining your spear during a campaign is another full-time job nobody prepared you for. The wooden shaft can crack, split, or break entirely if you're not careful, and replacement parts aren't exactly available at the medieval equivalent of Home Depot. You need to inspect the wood regularly for stress fractures, keep the metal point sharp and rust-free, and somehow manage to do all this while marching, fighting, and trying not to die. The spear point itself requires constant maintenance that would frustrate modern soldiers accustomed to reliable equipment. Medieval metallurgy wasn't exactly precision engineering, so spear points were often soft iron that dulled quickly or brittle steel that could snap under stress. Keeping your spear point sharp required whetstones, oil, and time, all of which were in short supply during active campaigns. Now, if you're incredibly lucky or have somehow distinguished yourself in battle, you might eventually get access to a sword. Congratulations! You now own a weapon that's probably going to get you killed in new and creative ways. Medieval swords weren't the elegant, lightweight weapons depicted in movies. They were heavy, clumsy instruments designed for specific types of combat that require years of training to master effectively. Your sword, if you can call the battered, second-hand weapon you've been issued, a sword weighs between 2 and 4 pounds, depending on its size and construction. That might not sound like much, but try holding a 4-pound weight at arm's length and swinging it around for 10 minutes. Your arms will feel like overcooked spaghetti, and that's before anyone starts trying to kill you. Medieval sword fighting was primarily an endurance contest disguised as martial arts. The basic mechanics of sword combat would horrify modern fencers. Medieval swordsmanship wasn't about elegant thrusts and parries. It was about generating enough force to damage an opponent through armor or finding gaps in their protection where you could deliver a lethal thrust. This required strength, endurance, and techniques that prioritized effectiveness over aesthetics. Historians still argue whether medieval swords were primarily cutting weapons or thrusting weapons, but the reality is that they were whatever the situation demanded. Against unarmored opponents, swords could deliver devastating cuts that could sever limbs or inflict massive bleeding wounds. Against armored opponents, swords became precision thrusting instruments used to target gaps in armor coverage. The Hollywood version of sword fighting, two opponents dancing around each other while their blades ring musically in the air, bears no resemblance to actual medieval combat. Real sword fighting was brief, violent, and often decided by a single mistake or moment of bad luck. Most sword fights lasted seconds, not minutes, and usually ended with one participant dead or severely injured. Medieval sword combat techniques included grappling, punching, kicking, and using the sword's crossguard and pommel as weapons. The famous German fighting manual known as the Fechtbuch shows techniques that look more like mixed martial arts than elegant fencing. Swords were tools of war, not sporting equipment, and medieval warriors used them accordingly. But swords aren't your biggest worry. The weapon most likely to kill you is the crossbow, a medieval precision instrument that can punch through armor at ranges that would make modern snipers jealous. Crossbows were the medieval equivalent of modern rifles, mechanical devices that allowed relatively untrained soldiers to kill experienced warriors with a single shot. They were so effective that the Catholic Church tried to ban their use against Christians, which should tell you everything you need to know about their lethality. A crossbow bolt fired from a powerful weapon could penetrate mail armor at over 200 yards and punch through plate armor at closer ranges. The mechanical advantage of the crossbow's leverage system generated far more force than any human archer could produce with a traditional bow. This made crossbows the great equalizer of medieval warfare. A peasant with a crossbow could kill a knight who had trained for warfare his entire life. The psychological impact of crossbow warfare was as devastating as the physical effects. Traditional archery required visible archers who drew their bows in coordinated volleys. Crossbow bolts could come from hidden positions, giving defenders no warning of incoming fire. The mechanical clicking of crossbow triggers being squeezed became a sound that terrified medieval soldiers. Crossbow technology evolved rapidly during the medieval period, with innovations that increased power, accuracy, and rate of fire. Steel crossbows could generate enormous force, but they required mechanical aids like windlasses or lever systems to cock. These powerful weapons could take a minute or more to reload, making them devastating for initial volleys but less effective in sustained combat. Loading a crossbow under combat conditions is a complex process that makes you a sitting duck for enemy attack. You have to place your foot in a stirrup at the front of the weapon. Use your entire body weight to pull the string back to the firing position. Place the bolt in the groove, and fire all while people are trying to kill you. If you mess up any step in this process, you're holding an expensive club instead of a ranged weapon. The arrows and bolts used with medieval ranged weapons were engineering marvels that required skilled craftsmen to produce. Each arrow had to be perfectly balanced, with fletching feathers that stabilized flight and points designed for specific targets. Bodkin points could penetrate armor, while broadheads caused massive bleeding in unarmored targets. Quality arrows were expensive and often in short supply during campaigns. Medieval battles consumed arrows and bolts at incredible rates, creating logistical challenges that could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. The famous Battle of Agincourt saw English archers fire an estimated 72,000 arrows in a single day. Armies needed dedicated supply trains just to transport enough ammunition for their ranged weapons, and running out of arrows could force a retreat regardless of other tactical considerations. Then there are the melee weapons designed specifically to deal with armored opponents' misses, warhammers, and other blunt instruments that could crush armor and the person inside it. These weapons don't look particularly intimidating, but they represent some of the most efficient killing tools ever devised. A warhammer could concentrate the force of a swing into a tiny point that could punch through the best armor available. Blunt weapons were psychologically terrifying because armor provided no protection against them. A mace blow could shatter bones, cause internal bleeding, and inflict concussions even if it didn't penetrate armor. Medieval warriors feared blunt weapons more than swords because they negated the protection that expensive armor was supposed to provide. The techniques for using blunt weapons were fundamentally different from blade weapon combat. Instead of precision cuts or thrusts, blunt weapon fighting was about generating maximum force and delivering it to vulnerable targets. This required different muscle groups, different timing, and different tactical approaches than other forms of medieval combat. Medieval weapon maintenance was a constant concern that affected combat effectiveness as much as training or tactics. Wooden handles could crack or break, metal components could rust or dull, and complex mechanisms like crossbow triggers could fail at critical moments. Soldiers spent hours each day maintaining their equipment, and weapon failure during combat was often a death sentence. The metallurgy of medieval weapons varied dramatically depending on the quality of materials and craftsmanship available. The best weapons were made from high-carbon steel that could hold a sharp edge and withstand the stresses of combat. Cheaper weapons were made from soft iron that dulled quickly or brittle steel that could shatter under stress. Most soldiers used whatever weapons they could afford or acquire, regardless of quality. Weapon training focused on techniques that were effective in the chaos of actual combat rather than elegant demonstration forms. Medieval fighting manuals show practical techniques for killing opponents quickly and efficiently, often using dirty tactics that would be considered unsporting in modern martial arts. The goal was survival, not honor, and medieval warriors fought accordingly. The range limitations of medieval weapons created tactical challenges that determined the flow of battle. Spears had reach but were unwieldy in close combat. Swords were versatile but required getting within striking distance of opponents who were trying to kill you. Crossbows were powerful but slow to reload. Each weapon had advantages and disadvantages that had to be considered in the context of specific combat situations. Combined arms tactics evolved to address the limitations of individual weapons by using different weapon systems together. Spearmen could hold enemy infantry at bay while crossbowmen provided supporting fire. Swordsmen could exploit gaps created by other weapons or finish opponents disabled by ranged attacks. Medieval battles were won by coordination between different weapon systems, not by individual heroics. The economics of medieval weapons affected their distribution and use in ways that shaped entire battles. Expensive weapons like swords were concentrated among wealthy soldiers and professional warriors, while common soldiers used cheaper alternatives like spears and agricultural tools converted for warfare. The weapon you carried often reflected your social status as much as your military role. Improvised weapons played a larger role in medieval warfare than most people realize. Farming tools like scythes, flails, and pitchforks were commonly used by peasant soldiers who couldn't afford proper weapons. These improvised weapons could be surprisingly effective, particularly against unarmored opponents, but they required different techniques and had unique limitations. The psychological aspects of weapon combat were as important as the physical skills. Medieval soldiers had to overcome natural human reluctance to harm other people while dealing with the terror of being attacked themselves. The sight, sound, and smell of combat created sensory overload that could cause panic or freeze responses that were often fatal. Your weapon becomes an extension of your body during combat, but it's an extension that can fail, break, or be lost at any moment. Medieval soldiers carried backup weapons when possible, but weight limitations and cost considerations often made this impossible. Losing your primary weapon during combat meant improvising with whatever was available or fighting hand-to-hand against opponents who still had proper weapons. Now that you're armed with weapons you barely know how to use and wearing armor that's slowly killing you through heat exhaustion, it's time for the real nightmare to begin: medieval siege warfare. Forget everything you think you know about quick, decisive battle. Siege warfare was a months-long ordeal of psychological torture, deliberate starvation, and creative attempts to break both your body and your mind before the actual fighting even started. Picture yourself standing on the walls of a medieval castle as the enemy army approaches. From a distance, it looks almost majestic: thousands of soldiers marching in formation, colorful banners flapping in the wind, the sun glinting off their armor and weapons. It's like watching the world's most expensive and deadly parade. But as they get closer, the reality sets in. You're about to be trapped inside these walls for months or possibly years while people outside try increasingly creative ways to kill you. The first thing the besieging army does is surround your castle completely, cutting off all supply lines and escape routes. This isn't just a military tactic, it's the beginning of a deliberate process designed to slowly starve you into submission. The attackers set up their own fortified camps, creating what's essentially a temporary city dedicated entirely to the art of making your life miserable. They're not in any hurry because time is on their side, and they know it. Medieval siege warfare was primarily a waiting game where the defenders slowly consumed their stored food, water, and morale while the attackers built increasingly sophisticated methods of destruction outside the walls. The psychological pressure of knowing that every day brought you closer to starvation was often more effective than any siege engine. Defenders had to ration food carefully while watching their supplies dwindle and wondering if relief would ever come. The castle you're defending might look impressively strong from the outside, but living inside it during a siege reveals all its weaknesses. The sanitation systems that barely function during peacetime completely break down when hundreds of soldiers and civilians are trapped together for months. The waste disposal systems can't handle the increased load, and soon you're living in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. Water becomes your most precious resource and your biggest vulnerability. Medieval castles typically relied on wells or rainwater collection systems that weren't designed to supply large populations for extended periods. The enemy knows this, and one of their first priorities is to cut off or contaminate your water supply. They might divert streams, poison wells, or simply wait for you to consume your stored water reserves. The psychological warfare begins almost immediately. The besieging army uses drums, horns, and shouting to create constant noise that prevents sleep and gradually wears down the defenders' mental resistance. They might display captured prisoners or deserters being tortured in view of the castle walls, creating a clear message about what happens to people who oppose them. Sleep deprivation becomes a weapon as effective as any siege engine. Historians still argue whether psychological warfare or actual military tactics were more important in determining siege outcomes, but defenders consistently reported that the mental strain of siege warfare was often harder to endure than the physical hardships. The constant stress of knowing that each day might bring a successful assault created anxiety that accumulated over time and affected decision-making abilities. The enemy's siege engines are works of engineering that would impress modern military engineers, and they're all designed to kill you in spectacularly unpleasant ways. The trebuchet, a massive counterweight-powered catapult, can hurl 300-pound stones over castle walls with enough force to crush anything they hit. But stones are just the beginning. Creative besiegers also launched diseased animal carcasses, human waste, and even plague victims over the walls to spread disease among the defenders. Trebuchets weren't just weapons, they were instruments of terror designed to break morale as much as walls. The sound of a massive stone crashing into castle fortifications could be heard for miles, and the psychological impact of constant bombardment wore down defenders' will to resist. The unpredictability of where the next stone would hit created constant anxiety that prevented normal activities and rest. The ballista, essentially a giant crossbow, could punch holes through wooden barriers and pin multiple people to walls with enormous bolts. These weapons were accurate enough to target specific individuals, making any appearance on the castle walls potentially fatal. Defenders learned to move quickly between covered positions and never to expose themselves unnecessarily to enemy fire. But the most terrifying siege weapon is probably the battering ram, a massive wooden beam reinforced with iron and operated by dozens of men, who want nothing more than to break down your front door and let their friends in to kill everyone inside. The constant pounding of the ram against the castle gates creates a rhythmic thunder that you can feel in your bones. Each impact shakes the entire structure and brings the enemy one step closer to breaking through your defenses. The battering ram crews worked under extreme danger, exposed to defensive fire from the castle walls while operating their massive weapon. Defenders poured boiling oil, dropped stones, and fired arrows at the ram crews, creating horrific casualties among the attackers. But the rams were often protected by wooden shields or covered galleries that made them difficult to stop once they reached the gates. Siege towers were mobile fortresses that allowed attackers to bring armed men up to the level of castle walls, creating the medieval equivalent of a violent elevator system. These towers, sometimes called belfries, could be several stories tall and house dozens of soldiers. Watching a siege tower approach your section of wall was like seeing your own death walking toward you on wooden wheels. The construction of siege engines required skilled engineers and massive amounts of resources, creating logistical challenges that could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. Trees had to be cut, rope manufactured, metal components forged, and everything assembled by skilled craftsmen who were often targeted by defensive fire. Building siege engines under combat conditions was dangerous work that claimed many lives among the attackers. Mining was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of siege warfare because you couldn't see it happening. Enemy engineers would dig tunnels under your castle walls, supporting the excavations with wooden beams. When the tunnel was complete, they would set fire to the supports, causing the tunnel to collapse and hopefully bringing down a section of wall. You could sometimes hear them digging below you, but there wasn't much you could do to stop them. Countermining became a desperate defensive technique where castle defenders tried to dig their own tunnels to intercept enemy miners. These underground battles were fought in cramped, dark conditions where soldiers crawled through narrow passages and fought hand-to-hand combat in spaces barely large enough for one person. The psychological terror of underground fighting was extreme, and many soldiers preferred to face siege engines rather than go underground. The smell of a besieged castle is something no historical account adequately describes, but it becomes one of the most oppressive aspects of the entire experience. Hundreds of people trapped together without adequate sanitation creates an atmosphere that would gag modern city dwellers. Add to this the smell of cooking food when rations are short, the stench of infected wounds, and the odor of death when people start dying faster than they can be buried. Food rationing during sieges followed brutal mathematics that assigned different ration levels based on military usefulness. Fighting men received the most food, followed by essential workers like smiths and engineers. Civilians, particularly women and children, received progressively smaller rations as supplies dwindled. These decisions created moral dilemmas that haunted commanders and often led to internal conflicts among the defenders. Disease spread rapidly in the confined, unsanitary conditions of a besieged castle. Dysentery, typhus, and other infectious diseases often killed more defenders than enemy action. The close quarters made it impossible to isolate sick individuals, and the stress and poor nutrition weakened immune systems. Some castles surrendered simply because too many defenders had become too sick to continue fighting. The winter siege was a special kind of nightmare that tested human endurance beyond reasonable limits. Heating a castle during winter consumed enormous amounts of fuel, but maintaining fires also created smoke that could be seen by attackers and revealed defensive positions. Cold weather made everything more difficult. Weapons became harder to operate, wounds healed more slowly, and the general misery of siege conditions multiplied exponentially. Medieval siege warfare included elaborate rules of engagement that determined what happened when a castle finally fell. If defenders surrendered before the walls were breached, they might be allowed to leave with their lives and property. But if they forced the attackers to take the castle by storm, the traditional rules of war allowed the attacking army to kill everyone inside and take everything as plunder. This created powerful incentives for early surrender, but also made it difficult to know when to give up. The decision to surrender was often the most difficult choice a castle commander had to make. Surrendering too early meant abandoning your lord's property and possibly facing execution for cowardice. Waiting too long meant certain death for everyone under your command. The timing of surrender required calculating dozens of factors: food supplies, enemy intentions, possibility of relief, and the morale of your own forces. Relief armies created false hope that could be more psychologically damaging than accepting that no help was coming. Rumors of approaching friendly forces spread rapidly through besieged castles, often based on nothing more than wishful thinking. When these hoped-for relief forces failed to materialize, the disappointment often caused more damage to morale than months of siege warfare. Communication with the outside world was nearly impossible during a siege, creating an information vacuum that enemy forces could exploit. The attackers controlled what information reached the defenders, often spreading false news about defeats of friendly forces or exaggerated claims about their own strength. This information warfare was designed to break down resistance by convincing defenders that their situation was hopeless. The social dynamics inside a besieged castle created unique pressures that could lead to internal conflicts as dangerous as external attacks. Different social classes had different ideas about when to surrender, how to distribute food, and who should take the greatest risks. These tensions often exploded into violence when the stress of siege warfare became unbearable. Escape attempts were common during long sieges, but they were incredibly dangerous and rarely successful. Defenders who tried to slip through enemy lines faced execution if captured, and their failure often brought retaliation against those who remained in the castle. But the psychological pressure of confinement drove some people to attempt escape regardless of the risks. The end of a siege, whether through surrender or successful assault, rarely brought relief for the defenders. Surrender might mean exile, imprisonment, or execution depending on the political circumstances. A successful assault usually meant massacre, torture, and the destruction of everything you had spent months trying to protect. Either way, survival through a medieval siege often meant losing everything you had fought to defend. The aftermath of siege warfare left permanent psychological scars on survivors that affected them for the rest of their lives. The experience of months-long confinement, constant threat of death, and the moral compromises required for survival created what we might recognize today as post-traumatic stress disorder. Many siege survivors never fully recovered from the experience and lived the rest of their lives haunted by memories of the walls that had both protected and imprisoned them. So you've somehow survived months of siege warfare and made it through to actual battlefield combat. Congratulations. You've unlocked the next level of medieval nightmare. Now it's time to experience medieval battlefield medicine, which is to modern medical care what a rusty butter knife is to neurosurgery. Prepare yourself for a world where the cure is often worse than the disease, and where surviving your wounds might be more terrifying than dying from them. Let's start with the sobering reality of medieval battlefield casualties. Most wounded soldiers didn't die from their initial injuries. They died days or weeks later from infection, blood loss, or the well-intentioned but utterly horrifying medical treatments administered by people who thought evil spirits caused disease and bloodletting cured everything. The survival rate for serious battlefield wounds was so low that many soldiers preferred to die quickly on the battlefield rather than endure the prolonged agony of medieval medical care. The statistics of medieval battlefield survival are absolutely terrifying when compared to modern combat medicine. While modern military medical care can save over 90% of wounded soldiers who reach treatment facilities, medieval battlefield medicine had success rates that were essentially the inverse. A serious wound in medieval combat was often a death sentence that just took longer to execute than an immediate killing blow. Your first battlefield wound, and if you're fighting in medieval combat, you will get wounded, introduces you to the medieval understanding of anatomy, which is roughly equivalent to a child's understanding of rocket science. Medieval physicians believed the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness and injury were thought to result from imbalances in these humors, so treatment focused on restoring balance rather than addressing actual medical problems. The theory of humoral medicine created treatment protocols that were often directly counterproductive to healing. If you had a fever from an infected wound, medieval physicians might conclude that you had too much hot blood and would proceed to bleed you, removing the very resources your body needed to fight infection. This medical framework was internally consistent but completely divorced from biological reality. Medieval physicians also believed that pus formation in wounds was a positive sign of healing, calling it laudable pus. They actively encouraged pus production and became concerned if wounds didn't develop infections. This belief led to treatment protocols that deliberately introduced contaminants into wounds, ensuring that minor injuries became life-threatening infections. The moment you take an arrow to the leg, you'll discover that removing medieval projectiles is infinitely more complicated than putting them there in the first place. Arrowheads were designed to penetrate deeply and stay put. Some had barbed edges that made removal nearly impossible without causing massive additional tissue damage. The standard procedure for arrow removal often involved pushing the arrow completely through the body and out the other side, which sounds exactly as pleasant as you'd imagine. Medieval arrowheads came in dozens of different designs, each creating unique medical challenges. Bodkin points were designed to penetrate armor but created narrow, deep wounds that were difficult to clean and prone to infection. Broadhead arrows caused massive tissue damage and bleeding that was often fatal even if the arrow was successfully removed. Barbed hunting arrows were nearly impossible to extract without destroying everything they touched on the way out. Medieval arrow extraction was performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or any real understanding of anatomy. The battlefield surgeon, often just a soldier with more experience treating wounds than his colleagues, would use whatever tools were available to dig around inside your body looking for arrowheads. Pliers, knives, and even specialized arrow extraction tools called arrow spoons were used to grab projectiles and yank them out, usually taking significant amounts of flesh with them. The arrow spoon was a medieval medical instrument that looked like a medieval torture device, which tells you everything you need to know about medieval surgery. This tool had a curved, spoon-shaped end designed to slide along the arrow shaft and capture the arrowhead for extraction. In practice, using an arrow spoon often caused more damage than leaving the arrow in place. But medieval medical theory demanded that foreign objects be removed from the body. The extraction process itself was brutal beyond modern comprehension. The patient was typically held down by multiple people while the surgeon probed the wound with metal instruments, trying to locate and grasp the arrowhead. This process could take hours and often required enlarging the wound to provide better access to the embedded projectile. Many patients died from shock during arrow extraction procedures. The pain of medieval medical treatment was so intense that many patients went into shock and died from the treatment itself rather than their original injuries. Soldiers learned to bite down on leather straps or wooden blocks to prevent themselves from biting off their own tongues during procedures. The screaming was so consistent that battlefield medical areas became known as much for the sounds they produced as for the lives they supposedly saved. Medieval physicians developed various restraint techniques to immobilize patients during procedures, but these methods often caused additional injuries. Patients were sometimes tied to tables or held down by multiple assistants, creating additional stress and trauma. The combination of extreme pain, physical restraint, and terror often caused patients to lose consciousness, which medieval doctors interpreted as a positive development that made surgery easier. But arrows are the least of your medical worries. Sword wounds, spear thrusts, and mace injuries created the kind of traumatic damage that would challenge modern emergency room teams equipped with advanced surgical tools and antibiotics. Medieval battlefield surgeons tackled these injuries with iron tools heated in campfires, wine for disinfection, and prayers to various saints who specialized in healing, a medical approach that was optimistic at best and catastrophic at worst. Sword wounds presented unique challenges because they often involved complex patterns of tissue damage. A slashing sword cut could sever muscles, tendons, blood vessels, and nerves in a single stroke, creating injuries that required microsurgery techniques that wouldn't be developed for another 1,000 years. Medieval surgeons could stitch skin together, but they had no way to repair the underlying damage to complex anatomical structures. Spear wounds were particularly dangerous because of their depth and the difficulty of assessing internal damage. A spear thrust to the torso could puncture organs, sever major blood vessels, or create internal bleeding that was impossible to detect or treat with medieval medical knowledge. Spear wounds often appeared minor from the outside while causing fatal internal damage that medieval physicians couldn't diagnose or treat. Mace and war hammer injuries created blunt trauma that was often more devastating than penetrating wounds. These weapons could shatter bones, cause internal bleeding, and inflict traumatic brain injuries that were completely beyond medieval medical understanding. A mace blow to the head might leave a patient conscious and apparently functional while causing brain damage that would prove fatal days later. The medieval understanding of blood loss was particularly problematic because physicians believed that bleeding was actually beneficial in many cases. If you were wounded and losing blood, the medical response might be to deliberately bleed you more to balance your humors. This therapeutic bloodletting was performed using leeches, heated cups that created suction, or simply making additional cuts to let more blood flow out of your already injured body. Bloodletting techniques varied in their brutality and effectiveness. Leeches were considered the gentlest method, but they were expensive and not always available during military campaigns. Cup bleeding involved heating glass cups and placing them on small cuts to create suction that drew out blood. The most direct method was simply opening veins with sharp instruments and allowing blood to flow freely until the physician decided enough had been removed. The timing and quantity of bloodletting were determined by complex astrological calculations and humoral theory rather than medical observation. Physicians consulted star charts to determine the optimal times for bleeding and used elaborate formulas to calculate how much blood should be removed based on the patient's age, constitution, and the phase of the moon. This systematic approach gave medieval medicine an appearance of scientific rigor while being completely divorced from medical reality. Historians still argue whether medieval medical practitioners did more harm than good overall, but battlefield statistics suggest that medical intervention often reduced survival chances rather than improving them. Soldiers with minor wounds who received no medical treatment often fared better than those with similar injuries who were treated by medieval physicians. This created the paradoxical situation where avoiding medical care improved your chances of survival. The documentation of medieval medical outcomes was poor by modern standards, but surviving records suggest that medical treatment often introduced complications that were worse than the original injuries. Infection rates were higher among treated patients, and recovery times were longer for those who received medical intervention. This pattern was so consistent that some military commanders began questioning whether battlefield medicine was worth the resources it consumed. Infection was the primary killer of wounded medieval soldiers, and absolutely nothing in medieval medical practice effectively prevented or treated bacterial infections. Wounds were often packed with substances that medieval physicians believed promoted healing: honey, wine, ground pearls, or crushed herbs, but these treatments were based on superstition rather than understanding of disease processes. Some of these folk remedies accidentally had antiseptic properties, but most were neutral at best and actively harmful at worst. Medieval wound dressings were made from whatever materials were available, often including cloth that hadn't been cleaned, animal products, and organic materials that harbored bacteria. These dressings were changed infrequently and often reused between patients without any attempt at sterilization. The practice of dressing wounds often introduced more contamination than it prevented. The medieval understanding of infection was based on the theory of miasma or bad air, which led to treatments that focused on protecting wounds from air exposure rather than cleaning them properly. Wounds were often sealed with wax, tar, or other substances that trapped bacteria and prevented natural drainage. This approach virtually guaranteed that minor wounds would develop serious infections. The development of gangrene in battlefield wounds was common and inevitably fatal without modern antibiotics. Medieval physicians could recognize gangrene by its distinctive smell and appearance, but their treatment options were limited to amputation or prayer. Amputation was performed with saws and knives, without anesthesia, and with survival rates so low that many soldiers preferred to take their chances with the gangrene. Medieval amputation techniques were brutal even by the standards of medieval medicine. The limb was typically removed with a saw or large knife, with the patient held down by multiple assistants. Blood vessels were sealed by cauterization with red-hot irons, creating additional pain and tissue damage. The survival rate for major amputations was less than 50%, and survivors faced lives of poverty and disability in societies that had little support for the disabled. The decision to amputate was often made based on superstition rather than medical assessment. Some physicians believed that gangrene would spread throughout the body if not removed immediately, while others thought that amputation would upset the body's humoral balance and cause death. These conflicting theories meant that treatment decisions were often arbitrary and inconsistent. Medieval surgical techniques were crude by any modern standard, but they represented the best medical knowledge available at the time. Surgeons learned their craft through apprenticeship and battlefield experience rather than formal medical education. The most skilled practitioners were often barber surgeons who combined hair cutting with basic medical procedures, which should tell you everything you need to know about medieval medical specialization. The barber surgeon profession evolved because both barbering and surgery involved cutting with sharp instruments, creating a logical combination of skills. Barber surgeons were more accessible and affordable than university-trained physicians, making them the primary medical practitioners for common soldiers. Their training was practical rather than theoretical, which sometimes made them more effective than their more educated colleagues. The guild system that governed medieval trades created additional complications for medical practice. Barber surgeons, physicians, and apothecaries belonged to different guilds with conflicting rules about who could perform which medical procedures. These jurisdictional disputes sometimes prevented patients from receiving the best available care because the most qualified practitioner wasn't legally allowed to provide certain treatments. The tools available to medieval battlefield surgeons were simple iron implements that served multiple purposes. The same knife might be used to cut food, trim arrows, and perform surgery, often without cleaning between uses. Surgical instruments were sharpened on whetstones, heated in fires for sterilization, though medieval physicians didn't understand the concept of sterilization and passed from one patient to another without any attempt to prevent cross-contamination. Medieval surgical tool design was based on function rather than precision, creating instruments that were effective for gross procedures but inadequate for delicate work. Surgical knives were often repurposed eating utensils or weapons, lacking the precision and sharpness needed for clean surgical incisions. Forceps and clamps were crude iron tools that often caused more tissue damage than they prevented. The maintenance and care of surgical instruments was poor even by medieval standards. Tools were rarely cleaned properly between uses and were often stored in conditions that promoted rust and contamination. Dull instruments made surgery more difficult and traumatic, but sharpening required specialized skills and equipment that weren't always available during military campaigns. Wound closure was accomplished using whatever materials were available. Silk thread for the wealthy, horsehair for common soldiers, or sometimes just strips of leather or plant fibers. These sutures were often contaminated before use and regularly caused additional infections. The medieval understanding of wound healing was so primitive that physicians often intentionally kept wounds open to allow bad humors to drain out, preventing natural healing processes. The technique of wound closure varied dramatically depending on the resources available and the training of the practitioner. Some surgeons used complex suturing patterns that demonstrated considerable skill, while others simply pulled wound edges together and hoped for the best. The quality of suture materials ranged from fine silk imported from distant lands to crude plant fibers that caused additional tissue damage. Medieval suturing techniques often created additional problems by pulling tissues too tightly together or failing to align wound edges properly. The lack of understanding about tissue layers meant that wounds were often closed superficially while deeper structures remained unrepaired. This approach led to wound dehiscence, where the surface closure failed and the wound reopened, often with worse complications than the original injury. Pain management in medieval medicine relied primarily on alcohol, opium when available, and herbal preparations that had varying and unpredictable effects. Alcohol was the most common anesthetic, but the quantities required to reduce surgical pain often caused additional medical complications or death from alcohol poisoning. Opium was expensive and rare, usually reserved for wealthy patients who could afford imported medications. Medieval herbal pain remedies included preparations made from willow bark, which actually contained salicin, precursor to aspirin. However, the dosages were uncontrolled and the preparations inconsistent, making these remedies unreliable and sometimes dangerous. Many herbal pain medications contained toxic substances that could cause additional health problems or death. The psychology of pain management in medieval medicine was based on religious and philosophical concepts rather than medical understanding. Pain was often viewed as spiritually beneficial or as divine punishment for sins, creating moral complications around providing pain relief. Some religious authorities opposed pain medication as interfering with divine will, limiting the options available to physicians. The psychological trauma of medieval medical treatment was often as damaging as the physical wounds being treated. Soldiers who survived battlefield surgery often developed what we would recognize today as post-traumatic stress disorder, not just from combat experiences but from the medical treatment itself. The combination of extreme pain, helplessness, and witnessing the suffering of other patients created lasting psychological damage. Medieval patients often developed what modern psychologists would recognize as medical phobia after experiencing medieval surgical procedures. The association between medical treatment and extreme pain created anxiety that made future medical care difficult or impossible. Many soldiers avoided seeking treatment for subsequent injuries because their previous medical experiences had been so traumatic. Now that you've survived battlefield medicine, or more accurately, survived in spite of battlefield medicinites, time to experience the daily reality of medieval military life. Forget the romantic notions of noble knights sharing hearty meals around crackling campfires. Your daily existence as a medieval soldier is a constant struggle against hunger, filth, and living conditions that would make modern prison inmates file human rights complaints. Welcome to medieval army hygiene, where clean is a relative concept and your immune system gets a workout that would challenge modern antibiotics. Let's start with the most basic necessity: food. Medieval armies moved on their stomachs just like modern forces, but the similarity ends there. Your daily rations consist primarily of hardtack, a brick-like substance that's technically bread but requires soaking in water or wine just to be edible. This hardtack is often months old, usually infested with weevils and other insects, and has the nutritional value of cardboard. But here's the thing. You'll learn to be grateful for those protein-rich bugs because they might be the only fresh meat you see for weeks. The hardtack biscuits that form the foundation of your medieval diet are engineered for longevity rather than palatability. They're baked multiple times to remove every trace of moisture, creating a product that can survive for years without spoiling but requires considerable effort to consume. You'll develop jaw muscles like a medieval nutcracker from the constant chewing required to break down these edible rocks, and your teeth will suffer permanent damage from the grinding action. When hardtack becomes too infested with insects or too moldy to eat safely, you'll discover the medieval soldier's survival technique of soaking it in whatever liquid is available: water, wine, or sometimes your own urine if you're desperate enough. The soaking process creates a porridge-like substance that's marginally more digestible but tastes exactly as appetizing as it sounds. The weevils usually float to the surface during soaking, which means you can pick them out if you're feeling particular about your protein sources. Your protein sources are equally unappetizing and often dangerous. Salt pork and beef form the basis of medieval army meat rations, but this preserved meat is so heavily salted that it's essentially edible leather that happens to be toxic if you eat too much at once. The salt content is high enough to cause kidney problems and dehydration, but it's the only way to preserve meat for military campaigns without refrigeration. You'll spend half your time craving meat and the other half trying to find enough water to flush the salt from your system. The preservation techniques for medieval military meat were effective at preventing spoilage but created new health problems. The salt curing process removed moisture and inhibited bacterial growth, but it also concentrated salt to levels that could cause sodium poisoning if consumed regularly. Medieval soldiers often suffered from kidney stones, high blood pressure, and other salt-related health problems that were directly attributable to their military diet. Medieval armies also carried dried fish when available, which provides essential nutrients but comes with its own set of problems. Dried fish is about as appetizing as it sounds: leathery, salty, and possessed of an odor that can be detected from considerable distances. The smell of dried fish permeates everything it touches, making your clothing, equipment, and personal belongings reek of decomposing seafood. But dried fish is rich in protein and essential oils, making it one of the more nutritionally complete foods available to medieval soldiers. Fresh food is a luxury that appears sporadically when armies can forage from the countryside or purchase supplies from local farmers. But here's where medieval military life gets particularly unpleasant. Armies consume local food supplies faster than they can be replenished, creating scarcity that drives up prices and often leads to confrontations with civilian populations. You might find yourself stealing food from peasant farmers who have barely enough to feed their own families, creating moral conflicts that add psychological stress to your already challenging existence. The foraging process, euphemistically called living off the land, often devolved into systematic looting that put armies in conflict with the populations they were supposedly protecting. Medieval soldiers learned to identify edible wild plants, hunt small game, and requisition supplies from civilian sources. These skills were essential for survival, but created additional risks from hostile locals who didn't appreciate having their food supplies commandeered. Cooking facilities in medieval armies were primitive and often inadequate for the number of soldiers they served. Large iron pots suspended over open fires provided the primary means of food preparation. But fuel for fires was often scarce and cooking took time that wasn't always available during military operations. Many meals were eaten cold or only partially cooked, creating additional health risks from undercooked meat and contaminated water. Water is your most precious resource and your biggest health hazard simultaneously. Medieval armies had no understanding of water purification, so you'll be drinking from whatever sources are available: rivers, streams, wells, and ponds that may be contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, or enemy attempts at biological warfare. The water you drink might taste fine but carry diseases that will kill you more slowly and unpleasantly than any weapon. Medieval water sources were often contaminated by upstream military camps, civilian settlements, and natural decomposition processes that weren't understood at the time. Armies camping near rivers often contaminated the water supply for downstream forces, creating disease transmission patterns that could affect entire campaigns. The practice of dumping waste into water sources was so common that finding clean water became a primary strategic consideration. The alternative to questionable water was ale or wine, which were safer because the fermentation process killed many harmful bacteria. However, maintaining supplies of alcoholic beverages for entire armies was expensive and logistically challenging. Soldiers often had to choose between potentially contaminated water that was free and safer alcoholic drinks that cost money they didn't have. Historians still argue whether medieval armies suffered more casualties from disease than from combat, but the evidence suggests that illness killed far more soldiers than enemy weapons. Dysentery, typhus, cholera, and other waterborne diseases spread rapidly through military camps where thousands of men shared contaminated water sources and primitive sanitation facilities. The close quarters and poor hygiene of medieval military life created perfect conditions for epidemic disease outbreaks. Speaking of sanitation, let's discuss medieval military toilet facilities, which is to say there weren't any. Thousands of soldiers concentrated in small areas created waste management problems that would challenge modern city planners. But medieval armies addressed these problems with all the sophistication of particularly disorganized barbarians. You'll relieve yourself wherever you can find a moment of privacy, which means the entire army camp becomes a hazardous waste site within days of establishment. The absence of organized sanitation in medieval armies created health hazards that affected every aspect of military life. Human waste accumulated in and around camps, creating breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects and contaminating water supplies. The smell alone was enough to affect morale and make living conditions nearly unbearable. But the health implications were far worse than the olfactory assault. Medieval soldiers developed informal protocols for managing waste disposal, usually involving designated areas downwind and downstream from camps. However, these arrangements were rarely enforced consistently, and the sheer volume of waste produced by large armies overwhelmed any attempt at organized disposal. Latrines, when they existed, were often shallow pits that filled quickly and overflowed during rain or heavy use. Personal hygiene becomes a forgotten luxury when you're wearing the same clothes for months while marching, fighting, and sleeping in whatever shelter you can find. Your clothing becomes an ecosystem unto itself, hosting populations of lice, fleas, and other parasites that make your life miserable while transmitting diseases between soldiers. The itching is constant and maddening, but removing your clothes to deal with the infestation exposes you to the elements and enemy attack. Medieval military clothing was designed for durability rather than cleanliness, which meant that garments could withstand considerable abuse but were difficult to clean effectively. Wool and linen garments absorbed odors and moisture, creating environments that encouraged bacterial and parasite growth. The practice of wearing multiple layers for warmth meant that infections and infestations could develop in areas that were difficult to access or treat. Lice infestation was so common among medieval soldiers that it was considered a normal part of military life rather than a medical condition requiring treatment. Different species of lice inhabited different parts of the body, creating multiple sources of discomfort and disease transmission. Body lice, head lice, and pubic lice each required different removal techniques, but soldiers rarely had the time or resources to address infestations properly. The psychological effects of constant parasite infestation were significant and often underestimated by medieval military leaders. The combination of physical discomfort, sleep disruption, and social stigma associated with lice and fleas created stress that affected combat performance and morale. Soldiers spending time dealing with parasites were soldiers not training, maintaining equipment, or preparing for combat. Bathing is a theoretical concept during military campaigns. Water that's safe enough to drink is too precious to waste on personal hygiene, and exposing yourself for bathing creates vulnerability to enemy attack. When bathing opportunities do arise, they're usually in the same contaminated water sources that created health problems in the first place. You'll spend months without properly washing, developing a personal aroma that could be classified as biological warfare. The few opportunities for bathing during medieval military campaigns often created as many problems as they solved. Soldiers bathing in streams and rivers contaminated the water for downstream use and exposed themselves to waterborne diseases. The lack of soap and clean clothing meant that bathing provided only temporary relief from accumulated filth and odors. Medieval soldiers developed various techniques for maintaining hygiene without formal bathing facilities. These included dry cleaning with sand or rough cloth, using snow when available, and applying herbs or oils to mask odors. However, these techniques were minimally effective and often created additional skin problems or allergic reactions. Your sleeping arrangements would horrify modern camping enthusiasts who complain about uncomfortable hotel beds. You'll sleep on the ground, often without any shelter, using whatever you can find for warmth and protection from the elements. Your bedding consists of the same clothes you've been wearing for weeks, maybe a thin blanket if you're fortunate, and possibly some straw or leaves if you have time to gather them before exhaustion takes over. Medieval military sleeping arrangements reflected the harsh realities of campaign life where comfort was a luxury that few could afford. Soldiers often slept in groups for warmth, sharing body heat and whatever bedding was available. This practice helped with warmth but facilitated disease transmission and created social tensions when privacy was impossible and personal space was non-existent. The lack of adequate shelter during medieval campaigns meant that soldiers were constantly exposed to weather extremes that affected their health and combat effectiveness. Rain, snow, heat, and cold all created challenges that modern military forces address with specialized equipment and shelter systems. Medieval soldiers had to endure these conditions with whatever protection they could improvise from available materials. Sleep deprivation was a constant factor in medieval military life that affected every aspect of soldier performance. The combination of uncomfortable sleeping conditions, guard duty requirements, and the stress of potential enemy attack meant that quality rest was rare and precious. Chronic sleep deprivation created cumulative effects that reduced reaction times, impaired judgment, and increased susceptibility to disease. The social dynamics of medieval military camps created additional challenges for daily life that went beyond the physical hardships of campaign conditions. Soldiers from different regions and social backgrounds were thrown together in close quarters for extended periods, creating tensions that could erupt into violence. The stress of poor living conditions, inadequate food, and constant danger amplified existing social conflicts and created new sources of friction between soldiers. Medieval armies included soldiers from various social classes, ethnic backgrounds, and regional cultures, creating a volatile mix of personalities and belief systems. The egalitarian nature of shared hardship sometimes broke down social barriers, but more often it created new conflicts as different groups competed for limited resources and blamed each other for their common suffering. The leadership structure in medieval armies was based on social class rather than military competence, creating situations where incompetent nobles commanded experienced common soldiers. This dynamic affected every aspect of daily life, from food distribution to shelter assignments, often creating resentment and reducing military effectiveness. Your daily routine as a medieval soldier involves waking before dawn, assuming you manage to sleep at all, and immediately beginning the tasks necessary for survival. Checking your equipment for damage, foraging for food, maintaining weapons, and preparing for whatever march or battle the day might bring. This routine continues regardless of weather, health, or personal comfort, creating a grinding existence that tests human endurance beyond reasonable limits. The maintenance requirements for medieval military equipment created daily tasks that consumed significant time and energy. Weapons needed sharpening, armor required cleaning and oiling, and clothing needed repair and replacement. These tasks were essential for survival but competed with other necessary activities like food preparation, rest, and military training. Welcome to the medieval version of biological warfare, where disease kills more soldiers than all the swords, spears, and siege engines combined. If you thought the daily hygiene conditions were bad, wait until you discover that medieval armies are essentially mobile disease laboratories where every conceivable plague, pox, and pestilence comes to party in your intestines. Your immune system is about to face challenges that would make modern epidemiologists weep with professional terror. Let's start with everyone's favorite medieval military companion, dysentery. This delightful condition turns your digestive system into a high-pressure water cannon that fires in the wrong direction, leaving you simultaneously dehydrated, malnourished, and socially isolated because nobody wants to be near you when the next wave hits. Dysentery spreads through medieval armies like wildfire through dry kindling, transmitted through contaminated water, food, and the charming medieval practice of not washing hands after using non-existent toilet facilities. Dysentery doesn't just make you uncomfortable, it literally drains the life out of you through a process that medieval physicians completely misunderstood. The constant diarrhea and vomiting quickly dehydrate your body while preventing you from absorbing nutrients from whatever food you manage to keep down long enough to digest. Medieval soldiers with dysentery could waste away to skeletal remnants within weeks, all while remaining technically functional enough to march and fight until they collapsed. The medieval understanding of dysentery focused on humoral imbalances rather than bacterial infection, leading to treatments that often made the condition worse. Physicians might prescribe additional purging to cleanse the system, removing even more fluids and nutrients from patients who were already dangerously depleted. The practice of bloodletting for dysentery patients was particularly counterproductive, removing blood volume from soldiers who were already suffering from dehydration and malnutrition. But dysentery is just the appetizer in the medieval disease buffet. Typhus, spread by body lice, turns your immune system against itself while creating a fever so high it literally cooks your brain. The lice that you've learned to accept as constant companions are actually tiny disease vectors carrying bacteria that will make you wish you'd died quickly in battle instead of slowly roasting from the inside while your mind dissolves into hallucinations and delirium. Typhus epidemics in medieval armies were devastating events that could destroy entire military campaigns without the enemy lifting a weapon. The disease spread rapidly through the close-quartered, lice-infested conditions of medieval military camps, creating casualty rates that often exceeded battle losses by enormous margins. Some historical campaigns lost more than half their forces to typhus before ever engaging the enemy in combat. The symptoms of typhus created unique military problems because affected soldiers remained mobile and functional during the early stages of infection while becoming increasingly confused and irrational. Typhus patients often continued performing military duties while experiencing fever-induced hallucinations, creating dangerous situations for themselves and their fellow soldiers. Command structures broke down as officers succumbed to the disease or became too delirious to make rational decisions. Medieval physicians had no understanding of typhus transmission and often prescribed treatments that actually encouraged lice infestation. The practice of keeping patients warm with heavy clothing and blankets created ideal conditions for lice reproduction, accelerating disease transmission throughout medical treatment areas. Some physicians even believed that lice were beneficial because they removed bad humors from the body. Cholera presents another delightful medieval military experience, transforming healthy soldiers into dehydrated husks within days through the simple expedient of making your intestines forget how to process water. Cholera spreads through contaminated water sources, which means every drink from questionable streams or wells becomes a potential death sentence. The disease strikes so quickly that soldiers can be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner, creating panic and superstition that affects military morale as much as the actual casualties. The rapid progression of cholera made it particularly terrifying for medieval soldiers who had no understanding of disease transmission or incubation periods. Apparently healthy soldiers would suddenly collapse with violent symptoms, creating the impression that the disease struck randomly or was caused by supernatural forces. This unpredictability generated fear that often proved more disruptive to military operations than the actual disease casualties. Cholera epidemics in medieval armies created logistical nightmares that overwhelmed military medical capabilities and supply systems. The volume of fluid loss from cholera patients required constant replacement that strained water supplies, while the rapid death rate created disposal problems that further contaminated camp environments. Military units could lose combat effectiveness within days as healthy soldiers were reassigned to care for the sick and dispose of the dead. Medieval treatments for cholera were not only ineffective but often accelerated death through additional dehydration. Physicians might prescribe purging agents to cleanse the system, adding artificial diarrhea to the natural symptoms of the disease. Bloodletting was considered appropriate for cholera patients, removing blood volume from individuals who were already suffering from severe dehydration and circulatory shock. Historians still argue whether disease or combat caused more military casualties during the medieval period, but statistical evidence suggests that illness was responsible for the majority of soldier deaths in most campaigns. Some estimates suggest that disease killed 3 soldiers for every one lost in battle, making medical conditions the primary threat facing medieval armies. This mortality pattern was so consistent that experienced military leaders planned campaigns around expected disease losses rather than combat casualties. But let's talk about the plague, the medieval disease that makes all other illnesses look like minor inconveniences. When plague hits your army, you're not dealing with sick soldiers. You're watching human beings transform into walking horror shows before dying in agony that no amount of medieval pain medication can touch. Plague comes in multiple varieties, each more terrifying than the last, and all of them spread through medieval military camps like rumors of incoming pay. Bubonic plague creates swollen lymph nodes called buboes that can grow to the size of chicken eggs and turn black as they fill with infected tissue. These buboes appear primarily in the groin, armpits, and neck, creating painful masses that make movement difficult and sleep impossible. The psychological impact of watching your body develop these grotesque swellings was often as devastating as the physical symptoms, creating panic that could destroy military discipline. Pneumonic plague attacks the lungs, creating a cough that spreads the disease through airborne droplets while slowly drowning victims in their own infected blood and fluid. Soldiers with pneumonic plague become walking biological weapons who spread death with every breath, creating transmission patterns that could devastate entire military units within days. The characteristic bloody cough of pneumonic plague was so distinctive that medieval soldiers learned to identify infected comrades by sound alone. Septicemic plague attacks the bloodstream directly, causing massive internal bleeding that turns the skin black and kills victims so quickly they might not develop the characteristic buboes of other plague varieties. This form of plague was particularly terrifying because it killed without obvious external symptoms, creating the impression that healthy soldiers were dying from supernatural causes rather than identifiable disease. Medieval armies had no effective treatments for any form of plague, and quarantine procedures were either non-existent or completely ineffective. The practice of housing sick and healthy soldiers together in close quarters ensured that plague outbreaks became epidemic disasters that could destroy entire armies. Some military units simply abandoned infected soldiers and fled, spreading the disease to new areas while failing to contain its transmission. The social breakdown caused by plague epidemics in medieval armies went far beyond simple casualty statistics. The rapid progression and high mortality rate of plague created panic that destroyed military discipline and command structures. Soldiers abandoned their posts, officers fled their responsibilities, and entire military units dissolved as individuals prioritized personal survival over military objectives. Medieval military medicine was completely inadequate to address epidemic disease outbreaks that required understanding of transmission patterns, quarantine procedures, and public health measures that wouldn't be developed for centuries. Military physicians trained in treating individual combat injuries were overwhelmed by disease outbreaks that affected hundreds or thousands of soldiers simultaneously. Smallpox adds another dimension of horror to medieval military disease, creating pustules that cover the entire body while generating fevers that could cause permanent brain damage in survivors. The pustules start as small bumps but grow into fluid-filled sores that eventually burst and scab over, leaving permanent scars that mark plague survivors for life. The psychological impact of physical disfigurement was significant in medieval society, where appearance often determined social and economic opportunities. Smallpox transmission in medieval armies was facilitated by the sharing of clothing, bedding, and equipment between soldiers who had no understanding of disease transmission. Contaminated materials could spread smallpox for weeks after infected soldiers had recovered or died, creating ongoing transmission that persisted even after obvious cases had been resolved. The practice of redistributing equipment from dead soldiers to living ones was particularly effective at spreading smallpox throughout military units. Medieval treatments for smallpox focused on bringing out the pustules through various heating methods that actually increased suffering without improving outcomes. Patients were often wrapped in heavy blankets and placed near fires to encourage pustule development, creating additional discomfort while providing no medical benefits. Some physicians deliberately infected smallpox pustules to help them mature, introducing additional bacteria that could cause secondary infections. The long-term effects of smallpox on military effectiveness extended beyond immediate casualties to include permanent disability among survivors. Smallpox could cause blindness, scarring that limited mobility, and neurological damage that affected cognitive function. Medieval armies that survived smallpox outbreaks often found themselves with large numbers of disabled veterans who required ongoing support while providing limited military capability. Scurvy presents a different type of medieval military health challenge, slowly destroying soldiers through vitamin deficiency rather than infectious disease. The limited diet available during military campaigns lacks the vitamin C necessary for basic bodily functions, causing your teeth to fall out, your wounds to refuse healing, and your energy levels to drop until you can barely function. Scurvy doesn't kill quickly, but it gradually reduces entire armies to shambling collections of exhausted, toothless invalids. The medieval understanding of scurvy was completely incorrect, attributing the condition to bad air, poor morale, or divine punishment rather than nutritional deficiency. This misunderstanding led to treatments that were ineffective at best and often harmful, such as bloodletting to improve the patient's humoral balance or purging to cleanse the system. The simple solution consuming fresh fruits and vegetables was often impossible during military campaigns but wouldn't have been prescribed even if fresh produce had been available. Scurvy symptoms appeared gradually, allowing the disease to affect military operations over extended periods without being recognized as a specific medical condition. Soldiers with early scurvy remained functional while experiencing increasing fatigue, joint pain, and slow wound healing that were attributed to the normal stresses of military life. By the time obvious symptoms like tooth loss and bleeding developed, the condition was advanced and difficult to reverse even with proper nutrition. The impact of scurvy on military effectiveness was cumulative and often underestimated by medieval commanders who didn't understand the connection between diet and combat capability. Armies suffering from widespread scurvy experienced reduced marching speed, decreased combat effectiveness, and increased susceptibility to other diseases that took advantage of weakened immune systems. Medieval armies operating in winter conditions or during extended sieges were particularly vulnerable to scurvy because fresh food became unavailable precisely when nutritional needs increased. The combination of cold weather, physical stress, and poor diet created perfect conditions for scurvy development that could affect entire military units simultaneously. The psychological effects of medieval military disease extended beyond the direct impact of illness to include the constant fear of infection that affected soldier behavior and military effectiveness. The unpredictable nature of disease outbreaks, combined with the lack of effective medical treatment, created anxiety that could be as disruptive as actual illness. Soldiers who spent their time worrying about disease were less focused on military objectives and more likely to make decisions based on fear rather than tactical considerations. Medieval soldiers developed various superstitions and folk beliefs about disease prevention that were usually ineffective but provided psychological comfort during epidemic outbreaks. These practices included wearing religious amulets, following dietary restrictions, and avoiding certain activities that were believed to attract illness. While these behaviors rarely provided medical benefits, they gave soldiers a sense of control over their health that was psychologically important for maintaining morale. The social dynamics of disease in medieval armies created conflicts between individual survival and military duty that challenged traditional concepts of honor and loyalty. Soldiers faced difficult decisions about whether to care for sick comrades, follow orders that might increase disease exposure, or abandon military objectives to preserve their own health. These moral dilemmas were complicated by the lack of understanding about disease transmission, making it difficult to balance personal safety with military responsibility. Now let's discuss how Mother Nature herself becomes your most relentless enemy during medieval military campaigns. Forget about the opposing army for a momentary, just humans with weapons, and at least they have the decency to attack you directly. Weather and terrain, on the other hand, are vast, implacable forces that will grind you down through exposure, exhaustion, and logistical nightmares that make enemy siege engines look like minor inconveniences. Welcome to medieval military life, where the environment is actively trying to kill you every single day. Winter campaigns are essentially extended suicide missions disguised as military strategy. Picture yourself marching through knee-deep snow while wearing metal armor that conducts cold directly to your skin, creating a personal refrigeration system that gradually freezes you from the inside out. Your breath creates ice crystals inside your helmet that obstruct your vision, while your fingers become so numb that you can't properly grip your weapons. The cold is so intense that exposed skin can freeze solid within minutes, creating frostbite injuries that will cost you digits, limbs, or your life. Medieval armies had virtually no understanding of cold weather survival techniques, treating winter campaigns as extensions of normal military operations with minor adjustments for temperature. Soldiers wore whatever additional clothing they could find or afford, but medieval textile technology provided inadequate insulation against extreme cold. Wool and linen garments became heavy when wet and lost their insulating properties, creating clothing that actively contributed to heat loss rather than preventing it. The logistics of maintaining fires during winter campaigns created tactical vulnerabilities that enemy forces could exploit. Fires required fuel that had to be gathered, transported, and protected from weather conditions that made combustion difficult. The smoke from fires revealed army positions to enemy scouts, while the time spent gathering firewood reduced available hours for military activities. Many medieval armies faced the choice between freezing to death and advertising their location to hostile forces. Frostbite in medieval armies was common and often led to amputations performed under battlefield conditions without anesthesia or antiseptic procedures. The medieval understanding of frostbite focused on rewarming frozen tissue through methods that often caused additional damage, such as rubbing affected areas or immersing them in hot water. These treatments could worsen frostbite injuries by causing additional tissue death, but medieval medical knowledge provided no better alternatives. Snow blindness affected medieval soldiers who had no understanding of ultraviolet radiation or protective eyewear concepts. The intense reflection of sunlight off snow could temporarily or permanently damage vision, creating tactical disadvantages for armies operating in winter conditions. Soldiers suffering from snow blindness became liability rather than assets, requiring assistance from healthy comrades while contributing nothing to military objectives. But winter is just one seasonal nightmare among many. Summer campaigns bring their own special torments, transforming your metal armor into a personal oven that slowly bakes you alive while you march across sun-baked terrain. The heat buildup inside armor can reach temperatures that cause heat stroke, delirium, and death from hyperthermia. You'll learn to recognize the early symptoms of heat exhaustion in yourself and others, but medieval armies had no effective treatments for heat-related injuries beyond removing armor and hoping for recovery. Medieval armor design prioritized protection over thermal comfort, creating equipment that was dangerous to wear in hot climates. The metal components absorbed and retained heat from sunlight and body warmth, creating internal temperatures that could exceed human tolerance levels. Soldiers wearing full armor in summer conditions faced constant risk of heat-related medical emergencies that could incapacitate them as effectively as enemy weapons. The water requirements for medieval armies operating in hot climates exceeded any reasonable supply capabilities, creating dehydration problems that affected entire military units. Soldiers required several gallons of water per day during summer campaigns, but medieval armies rarely carried more than basic drinking water supplies. The competition for limited water resources created conflicts within military units and forced commanders to make strategic decisions based on water availability rather than military objectives. Heat exhaustion symptoms in medieval armies were often misunderstood and attributed to cowardice, laziness, or moral weakness rather than medical conditions requiring treatment. Soldiers suffering from heat stroke might be disciplined for poor performance rather than receiving medical care, creating additional stress that worsened their condition. The lack of understanding about heat-related illnesses meant that preventable deaths were common during summer campaigns. Historians still argue whether medieval armies lost more soldiers to weather-related causes than to enemy action, but documentary evidence suggests that environmental factors were responsible for enormous casualty rates that often exceeded combat losses. Some military campaigns lost majority of their forces to weather, disease, and exposure without ever engaging enemy forces in significant combat. These environmental casualties were often unreported or attributed to other causes, making accurate historical assessment difficult. Desert warfare presents unique challenges that medieval European armies were completely unprepared to handle. The combination of extreme heat, water scarcity, and unfamiliar terrain created conditions that could destroy entire armies through dehydration and heat stroke. Medieval soldiers accustomed to temperate European climates found desert conditions almost impossible to endure, even with reduced equipment loads and modified tactics. The mirages and optical illusions common in desert environments created psychological stress and navigation problems that could lead armies astray for days or weeks. Medieval soldiers had no understanding of these phenomena and often interpreted mirages as supernatural manifestations or enemy deceptions. The psychological impact of seemingly endless, featureless terrain combined with extreme heat could break down military discipline and cause panic among troops who felt lost and abandoned. Navigation in desert conditions challenged medieval military leaders who relied on landmarks, river systems, and familiar terrain features for route planning. The absence of recognizable navigation aids, combined with shifting sand dunes and changing weather conditions, made accurate navigation extremely difficult. Many medieval armies became lost in desert regions and wandered for weeks while consuming their limited supplies. Mountain warfare creates different but equally challenging environmental problems that medieval armies were poorly equipped to handle. High altitude reduces oxygen availability, causing altitude sickness that affects physical performance and mental clarity. Medieval soldiers had no understanding of altitude physiology and often interpreted altitude sickness symptoms as signs of cowardice or moral weakness, creating additional psychological stress for affected individuals. The terrain challenges of mountain warfare included steep slopes that exhausted soldiers while making cavalry and siege engines ineffective. Medieval armies organized around heavy cavalry and large siege weapons found their primary tactical advantages neutralized by mountain terrain that favored light infantry and defensive strategies. The psychological impact of fighting in unfamiliar, hostile terrain often proved as challenging as the physical demands. Weather changes in mountain environments could be sudden and severe, catching medieval armies unprepared for temperature drops, storms, or snow conditions that appeared without warning. The thin air and intense sunlight of high altitudes created dehydration problems even in cold conditions, while the combination of physical exertion and reduced oxygen could cause cardiac problems in soldiers unaccustomed to mountain conditions. Supply chain management becomes exponentially more difficult when weather and terrain work against medieval logistics systems that were barely adequate under ideal conditions. A single snowstorm can block mountain passes for weeks, while spring floods can make rivers impassable and destroy bridges that armies depend on for movement and supply. Your food runs out, your equipment breaks down, and your entire military campaign grinds to a halt because nobody predicted that winter would be cold and wet. Medieval supply chains were vulnerable to weather disruption because they depended on transportation methods that were directly affected by environmental conditions. Horse-drawn wagons became useless in deep snow or mud, while river transport could be interrupted by flooding, freezing, or drought conditions. The failure of supply systems often forced armies to abandon military objectives and retreat to areas where they could obtain food and equipment. The psychological impact of supply shortages created morale problems that could destroy military effectiveness even before actual starvation set in. Medieval soldiers who knew their supply situation was deteriorating became increasingly focused on personal survival rather than military objectives, creating discipline problems and reducing combat effectiveness. The fear of starvation was often more disruptive than actual hunger. Foraging becomes a full-time occupation when supply lines fail, but medieval armies could strip the countryside bare within days, creating environmental devastation that affected entire regions for years afterward. The foraging process often put armies in conflict with civilian populations who depended on the same food sources for their own survival, creating guerrilla warfare situations where local populations actively opposed military forces. Muddy conditions create problems that would challenge modern military engineers equipped with advanced equipment and materials. Medieval roads were primitive at best, and heavy rain could transform them into impassable swamps that trapped wagons, exhausted horses, and slowed army movement to a crawl. Soldiers sinking ankle-deep in mud while wearing heavy armor and equipment experienced exhaustion that could incapacitate entire units. Medieval armies operating in muddy conditions faced tactical disadvantages that could determine battle outcomes regardless of military skill or equipment quality. Heavy cavalry became ineffective when horses couldn't maneuver in deep mud, while infantry formations lost cohesion when soldiers couldn't maintain proper spacing or move in coordinated patterns. Artillery and siege engines became useless when they couldn't be moved into position or operated effectively. The maintenance challenges created by muddy conditions affected every aspect of medieval military equipment and operations. Weapons required constant cleaning to prevent rust and maintain functionality, while armor needed continuous maintenance to prevent corrosion and mechanical failure. The time and effort required for equipment maintenance in adverse conditions reduced the time available for military activities and training. River crossings present tactical nightmares that could stop entire armies for weeks while engineers struggled to construct bridges using medieval technology and materials. Medieval armies had limited capability for river crossing operations, depending primarily on existing bridges or ford locations that could be defended by small enemy forces. The construction of temporary bridges required specialized skills, tools, and materials that were often unavailable during military campaigns. The tactical vulnerability of armies during river crossing operations was enormous because military units were divided and exposed while crossing, creating opportunities for enemy attack that could destroy entire forces. Medieval commanders had to balance the tactical risks of river crossings against the strategic necessity of maintaining military objectives, often choosing between dangerous crossing attempts and lengthy detours that consume time and supplies. Flooding could transform minor streams into major obstacles that stopped army movement for days or weeks while water levels receded. Medieval armies had no reliable methods for predicting weather patterns or flood conditions, making route planning a gamble that could determine campaign success or failure. The seasonal timing of military campaigns was often determined by water levels and weather patterns rather than strategic considerations. Forest warfare creates unique challenges that favor defenders while disadvantaging large, organized armies that depend on formation fighting and coordination. Medieval forests provided cover for guerrilla forces while limiting visibility and maneuverability for conventional military units. The psychological impact of fighting in dense forest conditions created stress and disorientation that affected military performance even among experienced soldiers. Navigation in forest conditions challenged medieval armies that depended on visual landmarks and celestial navigation methods that were ineffective under tree cover. Military units could become lost within hours of entering unfamiliar forest terrain, creating vulnerability to enemy attack while consuming supplies without making strategic progress. The fear of becoming lost in hostile forest terrain created psychological stress that affected decision-making and military discipline. The maintenance of equipment and supplies in forest conditions was complicated by humidity, lack of sunlight, and limited space for activities that required open areas. Weapons rusted more quickly in humid forest conditions, while leather equipment deteriorated rapidly when exposed to constant moisture. The storage and protection of supplies became major challenges when armies lacked adequate shelter from weather conditions. Seasonal weather patterns created predictable but unavoidable challenges that affected military campaign timing and strategic planning. Medieval armies operating during spring faced muddy conditions that limited mobility, while summer campaigns dealt with heat and drought that created water shortages. Autumn campaigns faced the risk of early winter weather, while winter operations were so dangerous that they were usually avoided entirely. The psychological impact of adverse weather and terrain conditions affected medieval military morale in ways that could determine campaign outcomes regardless of other factors. Soldiers facing constant environmental stress became increasingly focused on personal survival rather than military objectives, creating discipline problems and reducing combat effectiveness. The cumulative effect of weather-related stress often proved more damaging to military units than enemy action. And now we arrive at the final and perhaps most crushing reality of medieval military life. You don't matter. Not even a little bit. You are a disposable game piece in a chess match played by people who will never know your name, never care about your family, and never lose a moment's sleep over sending you to die for causes you don't understand in places you can't pronounce. Welcome to the medieval military hierarchy, where your life has less value than a decent war horse and considerably less importance than a lord's new pair of shoes. Let's start with the brutal mathematics of medieval military value systems. As a common foot soldier, you represent the lowest possible investment in human warfare technology. Your equipment costs less than a single horseshoe for a knight's destrier. Your training represents maybe a few weeks of basic instruction, and your replacement can be conscripted from any village within a day's ride. Knights, on the other hand, represent decades of training, thousands of gold pieces in equipment, and bloodlines that trace back to Charlemagne. Guess whose life gets prioritized when military decisions need to be made? The social hierarchy of medieval armies wasn't just about rankit, it was about fundamental assumptions regarding human worth that would horrify modern military personnel who operate under concepts like leave no one behind. Medieval commanders literally calculated battle tactics based on acceptable loss ratios, where losing 100 peasant soldiers was considered a reasonable trade for saving one knight. This wasn't callousness. This was military mathematics applied to a society where people had different intrinsic values based on their birth circumstances. Your position as a foot soldier means you're assigned to the most dangerous positions during battles while receiving the least protection and worst equipment. Knights fight from horseback wearing the best armor available, while you stand in the front lines holding a spear and hoping your cotton padding will stop something sharp. The tactical doctrine of medieval warfare used common soldiers as literal human shields, absorbing enemy attacks and creating opportunities for the valuable mounted warriors to achieve victory. Medieval battle formations deliberately placed expendable soldiers in positions where they would absorb maximum casualties while protecting valuable military assets. The infantry formations served as anvils against which enemy forces would break themselves, while cavalry provided the hammer that would deliver decisive attacks. This tactical approach required enormous numbers of disposable soldiers, whose deaths were calculated into battle plans as acceptable losses. The concept of tactical reserves in medieval warfare focused on preserving valuable units rather than supporting common soldiers engaged in combat. Knights and professional soldiers were held back from initial engagements to preserve their capabilities for decisive moments, while peasant infantry absorbed enemy attacks until tactical opportunities developed. This approach maximized the effectiveness of expensive military assets while treating common soldiers as expendable resources. But the expendability of common soldiers goes beyond battle tactics to encompass every aspect of medieval military life. Food distribution follows strict hierarchical patterns where knights eat meat and bread while you subsist on scraps and whatever you can forage. Medical care prioritizes valuable soldiers over common troops, meaning you'll wait for treatment while minor injuries of knights receive immediate attention from the best available physicians. Even shelter assignments reflect social hierarchies, with common soldiers exposed to weather while their social superiors enjoy whatever protection is available. The food distribution systems in medieval armies created nutritional hierarchies that affected combat effectiveness and survival rates among different soldier classes. Knights received protein-rich diets that maintained their physical condition, while common soldiers often suffered from malnutrition that reduced their effectiveness and increased their susceptibility to disease. These nutritional disparities were considered natural and appropriate rather than problems requiring correction. Medieval military justice reflected social hierarchies in ways that created different legal standards for different classes of soldiers. A knight who killed a common soldier might face minor penalties or no punishment at all, while a common soldier who struck a knight could be executed immediately. These legal disparities reinforced social hierarchies while creating resentment and tension within military units. The disciplinary systems used in medieval armies included punishments that varied dramatically based on social class, with common soldiers facing severe physical punishments for infractions that might result in minor fines for knights. Flogging, mutilation, and execution were common punishments for peasant soldiers, while knights typically faced monetary penalties, temporary confinement, or social censure for similar offenses. Historians still argue whether medieval social hierarchies improved or degraded military effectiveness, but evidence suggests that extreme inequality often reduced combat performance by creating internal conflicts and reducing morale among common soldiers. Some military units achieved better results when social distinctions were minimized during combat operations, while others were crippled by class conflicts that affected cooperation and unit cohesion. Your life expectancy as a medieval foot soldier is measured in months rather than years, with casualty rates that would be considered genocidal by modern standards. First-year soldiers had mortality rates exceeding 50% in active campaigns, with deaths from combat, disease, an accident creating a constant need for replacement personnel. The survivors of multiple campaigns represented a small elite among common soldiers, and their experience was valued primarily for training new recruits rather than for their individual worth. Medieval military record-keeping rarely tracked casualties among common soldiers with the same precision used for knights and noble casualties. The deaths of peasant soldiers were often recorded as simple numbers rather than individual names, reflecting their perceived value as interchangeable resources rather than unique individuals with families and histories. The replacement systems for medieval armies treated common soldier casualties as logistical problems rather than human tragedies, with standardized procedures for conscripting new personnel to fill gaps created by deaths, injuries, and desertions. These systems operated with the same efficiency used for replacing worn-out equipment or consuming supplies, reflecting the mechanical view of human resources in medieval military thinking. The psychological impact on common soldiers of knowing their expendable status created morale problems that affected military effectiveness in ways that medieval commanders rarely acknowledged. Soldiers who understood that their lives were considered worthless often developed fatalistic attitudes that reduced their motivation to fight effectively or survive dangerous situations. Communication between different social levels in medieval armies was strictly regulated and often prohibited entirely. You don't speak to knights unless spoken to first. You never question orders regardless of how stupid or suicidal they appear. And you certainly never offer tactical suggestions based on your ground-level view of combat situations. This communication hierarchy meant that valuable tactical information from experienced common soldiers rarely reached decision-makers who might have used it to improve military effectiveness. The information flow patterns in medieval armies created situations where tactical knowledge accumulated among common soldiers who had no mechanism for communicating their insights to commanders who made strategic decisions. This information bottleneck often resulted in repeated tactical errors that could have been avoided if social hierarchies had permitted upward communication of battlefield observations. Medieval military culture discouraged innovation and tactical adaptation among common soldiers, preferring obedience and conformity to initiative and creativity. Soldiers who attempted to modify their equipment, develop new techniques, or suggest tactical improvements often faced punishment rather than recognition, creating military cultures that resisted beneficial changes. The training systems for common soldiers emphasized compliance and basic skills rather than tactical understanding or independent thinking. Medieval military leaders preferred soldiers who would follow orders without question rather than thinking individuals who might challenge established procedures or suggest alternatives to current practices. Your quarters, when they exist at all, reflect your position at the bottom of the military hierarchy with accommodations that make prison cells look luxurious. Knights sleep in tents or commandeered buildings with actual beds and privacy, while you sleep on the ground wherever you can find space that won't flood when it rains. The concept of personal space is meaningless when 50 soldiers share an area designed for 10, creating living conditions that breed disease, conflict, and psychological stress. The sleeping arrangements for medieval armies created health hazards that disproportionately affected common soldiers who lacked the resources to obtain better accommodations. Overcrowding facilitated disease transmission, while exposure to weather conditions created hypothermia and other environmental injuries that reduced military effectiveness. Personal property rights in medieval armies were essentially non-existent for common soldiers, who were expected to share equipment, food, and shelter according to military necessity rather than individual ownership. This communal approach to resources created conflicts and resentment while reducing individual motivation to maintain or improve equipment. Privacy was a luxury reserved for the upper levels of medieval military hierarchy, with common soldiers living in conditions of constant observation and social pressure that created psychological stress and reduced morale. The inability to find solitude or personal space contributed to mental health problems that affected military performance. Your opinions about military strategy, battle tactics, or campaign objectives are not just unwelcome theory considered treasonous. Medieval military doctrine assumes that common soldiers lack the intelligence, education, and social standing necessary for strategic thinking. Your job is to stand where you're told, fight when ordered, and die quietly when your turn comes. Any attempt to think independently or question authority will be met with severe punishment that serves as an example to other soldiers who might develop similar delusions of relevance. Medieval military culture treated independent thinking among common soldiers as a threat to discipline and hierarchy rather than a potential source of tactical innovation. Soldiers who demonstrated intellectual capabilities were often viewed with suspicion rather than being promoted or utilized for their abilities. The punishment systems for insubordination were designed to create fear that would prevent other soldiers from questioning authority or thinking independently about military operations. Public punishments served as demonstrations of power that reinforced hierarchical relationships while discouraging individual initiative. Educational opportunities for common soldiers were non-existent, with medieval military leaders preferring ignorant soldiers who would follow orders without understanding their strategic context. This approach created armies of functionally illiterate fighters who could perform basic military tasks but lacked the knowledge necessary for independent operation or tactical adaptation. Even death doesn't free you from the class distinctions that define medieval military life. Knights who die in battle are mourned, remembered, and often commemorated with elaborate funeral rites that celebrate their contributions to military victory. Common soldiers who die are stripped of any useful equipment and buried in mass graves without ceremony, their deaths recorded as simple statistics rather than individual losses. Your family, if they ever learn of your death, will receive no compensation, no recognition, and no support from the military system that consumed your life. Medieval burial practices for military casualties reflected social hierarchies that persisted beyond death, with elaborate ceremonies for nobles and mass disposal for common soldiers. These practices reinforced social distinctions while providing no closure or recognition for the families of common soldiers who died in military service. Notification systems for military casualties were inconsistent and often non-existent for common soldiers whose families might never learn the fate of their relatives. Knights' deaths were carefully documented and reported to maintain political relationships, while peasant casualties were often ignored entirely. Compensation systems for military casualties favored noble families while providing no support for the dependents of common soldiers, creating economic hardships that could persist for generations. Widows and orphans of common soldiers often faced poverty and social marginalization without any assistance from the military organizations that had caused their losses. The memorialization of military service focused exclusively on noble participants while ignoring the contributions and sacrifices of common soldiers who had provided the majority of military labor and casualties. Military histories, monuments, and cultural celebrations commemorated knightly achievements while treating peasant soldiers as anonymous background figures. Your legacy as a medieval common soldier is essentially non-existent. No songs will be sung about your deeds, no monuments will commemorate your sacrifice, and no histories will record your name. You are one of thousands of interchangeable pieces in a military machine designed by and for people who consider you barely more valuable than the weapons you carry. Your life, your death, and your service will disappear into the anonymous mass of medieval military statistics, remembered only as part of casualty figures that justified someone else's tactical decisions. The historical record-keeping for medieval military campaigns focused on political and strategic developments while ignoring the individual experiences of common soldiers who provided the labor and sacrifices necessary for military operations. Modern historians often struggle to reconstruct the experiences of medieval common soldiers because contemporary sources considered their lives unworthy of detailed documentation. But here's the most crushing irony of medieval military hierarchy. Despite being considered worthless, you and soldiers like you actually determine the outcomes of medieval battles through your collective performance, endurance, and sacrifice. The great military victories celebrated in medieval history were achieved primarily through the blood and suffering of anonymous foot soldiers whose names will never be known. Knights may have provided the decisive tactical strikes, but common soldiers provided the foundation upon which medieval military success was built. As you drift off to sleep tonight safely in your modern bed, protected by laws that recognize your inherent human dignity, living in a society that at least pretends to value individual life, remember that for most of human history, people like you were considered as expendable as arrows or horseshoes. The concepts of human rights, individual worth, and personal dignity that you take for granted are recent innovations that medieval soldiers could never have imagined. So rest easy in your comfortable world, knowing that you'll never have to prove your worth by dying anonymously in someone else's war. Never have to accept that your life matters less than a stranger's horse, and never have to face the grinding reality that in medieval military life, you were nothing more than a tool designed to break so that more important people could achieve their ambitions. Sweet dreams, and be grateful that you live in a time when common soldiers are considered human beings rather than military equipment with legs. The soft glow of dawn never came for so many medieval soldiers, their stories lost to time like morning mist over forgotten battlefields. In the quiet darkness of your room tonight, you can rest knowing that the struggles and suffering we've explored together belong to centuries past, when human worth was measured in gold and bloodlines rather than simple humanity. The armor has rusted away, the weapons have crumbled, and the lords who commanded these expendable armies have long since turned to dust, leaving behind only the echo of their cruelty in dusty historical records. But perhaps, in some small way, remembering these anonymous soldiers, these farmers and craftsmen who never chose their fate, gives them a dignity that their own time denied them. Their lives mattered, even if no medieval chronicler thought to record their names or dreams. In the space between sleeping and waking, as consciousness fades like candlelight, maybe we can honor their memory by simply acknowledging that they existed, they suffered, and they were human beings who deserved better than the world gave them. Let their stories settle gently into your mind as you drift toward rest, not as nightmares to disturb your peace, but as quiet reminders of how far we've traveled from those dark centuries when individual lives held so little value. Sleep well, knowing that you live in a better time, and that tomorrow you'll wake to a world that recognizes your worth simply because you exist.